Thanks a lot, Eric. It's definitely a huge honor to be invited to be here and also to be able to talk about the Gunnison sage-grouse. Retta, wherever you went, that was a great presentation. I really appreciated what you were saying, and I definitely have an acquired or not so acquired taste. Love the sagebrush ecosystem, and it's just been a really awesome thing to be able to work on for the last 24 years. You can go ahead and open that, Eric. Okay. I'm over at Western. I'm a wildlife biologist at the college. I've been there for about 24 years. And about 20 years ago, I started a nonprofit organization called Siskiyou, and that's a Shoshone word that means sage-grouse. And we're working on behalf of the Gunnison sage-grouse and conservation efforts to conserve that species. So today I wanted to, and thanks to the invitation from Eric, just give a little bit of background on sage-grouse ecology and some of the conservation issues around sage-grouse. So some of the indigenous North American people think about the sage-grouse, the symbology of the sage-grouse as this idea of seasonality, this idea of a return, the cycles of life and how things are revolving, and the spiral, the sacred spiral they call it. And this is sort of this idea of the eternal return. Many people, many in this room, several in this room, but we have biologists and managers and landowners and students and volunteers that go out every spring and arrive on these certain landscapes where they're waiting, right, patiently for something to happen. And this happens early in the morning on March, April, May mornings. It's dark, it's pre-dawn, the sun hasn't come up yet, and we wait, and especially the early part of the spring, we're waiting because it's been a whole year, and we're wondering about this sacred spiral, we're wondering about this eternal return. Before it gets light, we get to hear this, right? This really bizarre and interesting sound that reverberates through the sage. And then when the sun finally comes up, we get to see this. And this is the male Gunnison sage-grouse. It's the one that's producing those sounds through vocalizations that are being enhanced by these air sacs that you can see sticking out of their chest. This bird is called Siskiyou by the Shoshones, as I mentioned, and also the Utes have a word sagagapuk to describe the Gunnison sage-grouse. This is a species that was only described 20 years ago in 2000 as a new species of bird, the first new species of bird in North America in over 100 years. So kind of an exciting thing for birds, birders and ornithologists and so on. But of course, this bird has been on the landscape for a very long time. It didn't just show up 20 years ago. But it finally got a different name, and we recognized it as a unique species from the other sage-grouse in North America. But anyway, this male sage-grouse is quite a bizarre and interesting and unique beast. You can see by its structure there that it's got this really large barred fan tail, and during its displays it fans out this tail. It lifts its wings up and takes a couple steps. It gulps in air and starts to inflate these air sacs, and then it throws its head over its thrusts its head forward. This ponytail goes flying through the air, and as it does this, these air sacs just come jiggling out of its body, and it's at that time making those plopping sounds that are resonating through the sagebrush. This bird is an acoustic beacon on the dance floor where it's doing its mating displays, and is drawing in other males to come to this dance floor. It's drawing in females maybe from 2, 3, 4 miles out through the sagebrush landscape to find the place where the action is happening in the spring. This is not a different species. This is actually the female of the Gunnison sage-grouse. So dramatically different looking bird, and it's smaller, and it fits its job very well, because what a female sage-grouse has to do is be a master of disguise. And it's a ground nesting bird, so it finds a spot. It's the shrub fort idea for a sage-grouse. There's plenty of space for a sage-grouse to hide under the sage. So it finds a nesting spot, and then it has this tremendous fidelity to these nests. And after it lays its eggs, it sits on the eggs for about 30 days in a row, spends about 96% of its time on the nest, not moving, not doing anything, but just protecting those eggs, warming them, allowing those chicks to grow inside the eggs. So as Retta was describing, all of this is happening in the sagebrush, right? The sage-grouse is what we call a sagebrush obligate species, so its whole life has evolved around the sagebrush. It eats the sagebrush, it nests in the sagebrush. Its whole cycle of life revolves around this ecosystem, and it can't exist anywhere else, right? So it's sort of constrained to this system, and so the fate of the sagebrush ecosystem dictates the fate of this bird. Here's a look at the annual cycle, or this life cycle of the sage-grouse. And if we start up here, just coming up here in the next month or so, we see the beginning of this life cycle where the sage-grouse are mating, and they find a specific place in the sagebrush ecosystem that is the mating ground, or what we refer to as a lek, L-E-K, a lek. And these are sort of open areas in the sagebrush where they can the males can do their displays, and the females come to these leks and check out all the males, and the female actually chooses which male she wants to mate with. So the males are competing and the females are choosing, and this is a very interesting and bizarre sort of ritual, right? It's very unique. About 5% of the 10,000 species of birds in the world use this sort of what we call a lek mating system. So we have a very unique biology that's going on out in the sagebrush. As I mentioned, after the females choose the male and mate, then they can go off the lek and into the sagebrush, and they can look for a place to nest. What this is illustrating here is this is a lek, and there's a circle around this lek that we think about 80% of the females nest somewhere within 2-3 miles of that lek where they bred. So if we can identify these locations where the birds are mating and draw a circle around them, those are sort of hot spots for areas to conserve and protect, because a lot of the production of sage-grouse is going to occur in that local area. This picture shows a female right there sitting on a nest, so you can see a little bit of sense of what good nesting habitat might look like. Ground nesting bird underneath the sagebrush, but a lot of residual grass left over from the previous growing season to help conceal the nests of these birds. Otherwise, they're very vulnerable. They're already very vulnerable, but extremely vulnerable if they don't have the right kind of cover to protect them. Once the chicks have hatched after that 30-day incubation period, then they hatch out of the eggs, and these chicks are ready to just leave the nest and walk. They're well developed, young after this 30-day incubation period. So they do what some biologists call is the death march, and they move across this sagebrush desert landscape trying to find some sort of wetter, moister environment, a seep, a spring, an ephemeral creek, a wet meadow. These are the areas that produce a lot of insects, and these are what the chicks need to be able to grow and survive during that brood rearing period. So even though these are kind of wetter areas in the landscape, there's always sagebrush nearby. These birds like to have that as cover and comfort, and so they move to those areas when they need to. By the end of the summer, the birds tend to form flocks and move off of these brood rearing areas and are starting to head toward their traditional wintering grounds. You might think that it's tough to be a Gunnison sage-grouse in the Gunnison winter, but they actually do very well for most winters anyway. Very high survival. These birds tend to roost underneath the snow, so they're in the shrubs, underneath the snow. It's a pretty nice environment under there. They've got plenty of food. They're eating the leaves of sagebrush, and so they can do pretty good. Now, in some winters, like we had last winter, where we had some really wet snow, and then very cold temperatures after that, you can build a real crust on that snow, and then the sage-grouse just don't have an entryway into that snow cover, and you can get some pretty high mortality and lower survival during winters like that. Okay. So as I was talking about the lek mating system, 5% of the world's birds use this unique system. What's kind of interesting about it is that in this male competition, female choosing, most females seem to find the same males to have the right traits, right? And so very few males actually mate and pass on their genes. Maybe 10 to 15% of the males on a lek will be successful in mating. So that means 85 to 90% of the males are not being successful in mating, right? One of my friends who's a sage-grouse researcher out of California, she watched a greater sage-grouse lek, and she watched one male mate with 23 females in just a 2-hour time span. So it just goes to show you how uneven and unbalanced the mating is among these birds, right? So what this does is it leads to fewer males passing on their genes. It means that you have lower genetic variation. You also have these birds that are going back to the same site year after year after year. This is one of the key characteristics of this lek mating system, is that the leks are traditional. There's high site fidelity. The birds keep returning year after year to the same place. That, in addition to the few males that are mating, just naturally make these birds have less genetic variation and more susceptible to various things that are happening to them. Just quickly, this is a map that shows the overall range of historical of Gunnison sage-grouse: Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. This is a little bit of a blow-up of it, and the darker green is showing the current range of the Gunnison sage-grouse. They occupy about 10% of their historic range. And this circle here, of course, is the Gunnison Basin, which is the largest population. There's about 85% of the global population resides in this, in our backyard, right here. This is a photo that I just found somewhere on the internet, but the story comes from the Lake City newspaper back in 1894, and there was a story that this guy, Billy Green, went out on Saponaro Mesa, and he bagged 863 sage-grouse on a single Sunday afternoon. So it's just really difficult to wrap your mind around this number and to think about how many sage-grouse were out there on the landscape for a single person to walk around in one local area and be able to bag that many birds in an afternoon. In fact, I'm going to show you in a minute the current estimated population size, and this number is twice as large as the number of males that were counted in the worldwide population last year. So we had a lot more sage-grouse on the landscape historically. And with this great overexploitation, we didn't have hunting laws, we didn't have good regulations or enforcement. Back at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, we probably saw this major decline in sage-grouse populations all over North America due to overexploitation of the birds. Lots of other things happened. One figure I've heard from the BLM webpage is that there were about 20 million cattle and 25 million domestic sheep across the western rangelands back in 1900. That number today, I don't have really good numbers, but one number I found was there's about 2 million cattle. So we had just extraordinarily much higher numbers of livestock out on these landscapes 120 years ago. And it could be challenging and somewhat hard on these landscapes to have that much livestock out there. Up until the 1934, when the Taylor Grazing Act was passed, that was a, oops, that's me to tell me I'm done. We passed reform on grazing situations, and we set up the whole allotment system and reduced the stocking rates dramatically. And there's been a lot of effort to really bring science more into the grazing management and so on. One thing that happened after that, however, was this idea of trying to improve the range. And improve the range oftentimes meant get rid of the sagebrush. You can see by this it says heavily infested. It's infested with sagebrush, killing this one undesirable species. This comes from scientists that are studying the system, trying to increase the forage capacity of the land. But just to kind of demonstrate, I think, some of the changes in our perspectives over the last 70 years, I think most people now recognize that sagebrush isn't just a undesirable species that's infesting the landscape. Anyway, what are the main reasons that Gunnison sage-grouse declined? Just real quickly, habitat loss, habitat degradation, habitat fragmentation, introduction of invasive species. Here's one of them that Retta brought up. This is cheatgrass locally here. This is right up above the Roaring Judy Fish Hatchery. This is lower by Almont. This is Rainbow Lake Road. This is over at Dillon Pinnacles. This entire landscape is covered with cheatgrass. A big concern, as Retta described, the fire cycle and the way that you can completely convert a sagebrush ecosystem into a monoculture of grass. This is a very busy slide, but I just wanted to show you where we're at right now. These are just the 8 populations of sage-grouse over the years from 1996 over here to 2019. The high male counts. So in 2019, you can see our high male count was 429 males. And you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 out of those 8 populations had less than 10 males counted in those populations. By the way, this is the global population of Gunnison sage-grouse. Here's our Gunnison number, 363 out of the 429, so that's 85% of all the males that were counted here in Gunnison. There were some challenging weather situations last spring, and it was hard for people to get to all of the leks and make the counts that we normally make. So some of this is a reflection of some of the effort that we had, but some of it's also probably reflecting what's really happening. This graph is just showing those numbers over time, and we can see we've kind of reached a 25-year historic low population size. And if those numbers are for what we call the high male counts, but if we use this equation and calculate what our estimate of the worldwide population is, this is the number. So 2,103 sage-grouse exist on the planet today, according to this number. And I just wanted to say, too, that it's not only the sage-grouse that is potentially in jeopardy, but it's a sort of a indicator of what's going on with biodiversity and wildlife across the sagebrush ecosystem. All of these birds here are sagebrush obligate species, and many of them, like this guy, the brewer sparrow, which is probably the most abundant bird in the sagebrush, its population has declined by more than 50% in the last 50 years. And recently, the Lab of Ornithology, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, released a study in the last couple months looking at bird population trends over the last 50 years, and they estimated that we have lost 3 billion birds from our landscapes in the United States and Canada. So it's not just in the sagebrush, but across other habitats as well. So it's a big deal what's going on with bird populations. And just to wrap this up with a little more positive note here at the end, this map is trying to illustrate that the sage-grouse live on a landscape that is a mosaic of land ownership, right? Private lands, public lands, state public lands, federal public lands, county lands, and so on. They're living on a mosaic of land ownership, and it's very challenging to manage a species like that in the context of especially a species that lives over large landscapes. They require a lot of land, right? So they're going to be moving across boundaries, political boundaries, and so on. In order to drive Gunnison sage-grouse conservation, I think it's really important that we are trying to use the best available science, have a collaborative process, and don't forget one of the most important faculties we have is our imaginations and imagining a future where sage-grouse can be a part of that. And these are some of the, it's a long list, I won't go through them, but you can just get a quick look at some of the great things that have been going on in Gunnison over the last 20 years or so. On behalf of trying to conserve the Gunnison sage-grouse and keep it on this planet for a little bit longer. So, thank you. Somewhere there's a, this doesn't want to turn. There's an acknowledgement.